Thank all of you for coming tonight. As Rusty alludes to, over the last 7.5 years, I'm a 7.5 year veteran. I'm going on 8 years. And I've been employed by Coconino Community College. I've had the opportunity to deliver a number of Comet Talks on subjects as varied as political tribalism, the Russo-Ukrainian war, the spread of hyper-efficient and commonized corporate systems around the world, the relationship between Shakespearean and Kabuki theater, Elizabethan England, Okinawa, Japan, and several other topics. And I flatter myself that most of these have been well received. I hope tonight's talk will be as well. But I'll be honest with you, I'm opening this talk with a fair degree of anxiousness, trepidation, because in all of my time here at CCC, I dare say I have never addressed a topic that's politically charged or as emotionally fraught, or indeed as personally meaningful to me as the one I'm going to bring before you tonight. The subject of tonight's Comet Talk is a legal doctrine known as birthright citizenship, which you might have heard is currently being litigated before the Supreme Court. What I intend to do tonight is trace the origins of this doctrine as well as its impact on immigrant communities by telling this story through the prism of the life stories of 3 individuals, two of whom you may have heard about, and one probably not. First is John Elk, an American Indian from the Winnebago tribe, who lost a suit for his citizenship before the Supreme Court in 1984. The second is Wong Kim Ark, Los Angeles, the son of Chinese immigrants, who won a case for his citizenship for the same court in 1998. This case resulted in the creation of birthright citizenship as a legal doctrine, which has been in effect for the last century and a quarter. And last is a young man named Santiago from Loag City in the province of Ilocos Norte, Philippines, who emigrated to the United States, fought in World War II, and died in the war. But her story doesn't begin there. Okay. Our story begins on a sweltering summer day, Washington, D.C., June 8th, 1868. Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, forwarded it on to the states for ratification. The amendment was written by Representative John J. Ohio, an abolitionist and radical Republican, with contributions from Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan and the abolitionist firebrand Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Massachusetts, who pushed for the amendment to include strong provisions banning ex-Confederates from federal office. These 3 individuals are responsible for the text of what we now call the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The explicit purpose of this amendment was to convey American citizenship on the so-called freedmen, the former slaves, and to enshrine in the Constitution the principle that all citizens will be equal before the law, regardless of race or color. Or as Stevens put it in his speech that day, whatever law punishes a white man for a crime shall punish the black man in precisely the same way. Whatever law protects the white shall afford equal protection to the black man. Whatever means of redress is afforded to one shall be afforded to all. To ensure the principle of equal protection, the amendment defined the terms of American citizenship in Section 1 as follows. Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. The amendment's extension of citizenship to the freedmen was far from perfect. For one thing, Section 2 of the amendment explicitly excluded Indians not taxed. That was the phrase, Indians not taxed, from the impact of Section 1. So the 14th Amendment did explicitly exclude American Indians, Native Americans, from the extension of citizenship. In other words, so they're not yet granted citizenship. Nevertheless, as an historical artifact, the amendment represented a watershed moment in constitutional history by doing three things. First, it defined citizenship by place of birth, introducing a principle called jus soli. Jus soli. It's spelled J-U-S-S-O-L-I. It's a Latin phrase. It literally means right of soil. Right of soil into the text of the Constitution. Right to be a citizen of the United States by virtue of being born. Second, it incorporated the protections of civil liberties guaranteed to U.S. citizens and applied them to the state governments as well as to the federal government. This constitutional law is something known as the incorporation doctrine. So with the 14th Amendment, all of the protections guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, they cannot be transgressed by the state governments any more than they can be by the federal. And finally, it introduced a principle called equal protection into constitutional law, suggesting that all citizens must be treated equally under the law, protected from arbitrary or discriminatory treatment based on categories like race. All of which brings us to the first of the three individuals we're focusing on tonight, John Elk. Compared to the other individuals we're going to be talking about tonight, we know precious little about John Elk. We don't even have a contemporary photograph of him. I hope I've made that clear. We used AI to generate this image. Oh my. Right? This is not an actual photo. It is not a real photograph. But I used AI using a lot of contemporary information about the dress and demeanor of Winnebago Indians. I used AI to create this. This is not him. It's not him. This is ChatGPT's imagining of him. But I had pictures of everybody else, so I thought I'd include a picture of him, even though it's not him. So we know very little about his life. We do know that he came from the Winnebago tribe, although his people call themselves Ho-Chunk, which means something like people with the big voice. We also know from census records that in 1880, he was listed as being 35 years old, living with his wife in a wigwam, traditional native dwelling, on the bank of the Missouri River near Omaha, Nebraska. And that he was born in Iowa, and that he was illiterate because he signed his name with an X, and that he worked as a laborer. His tribal affiliation is significant. Like most North American tribes, the Winnebago were subject to forced migration by the U.S. government. Unlike most, they met that fate over and over and over and over and over and over again. From 1832 to 1865, they were compelled by the federal government to sign no fewer than 6 removal treaties, resulting in their forced relocation from their original homeland near Green Bay, Wisconsin. By the way, Winnebago means basically stinking water, or people from stinking water, which is what their neighbors called them. Apparently that part of Green Bay really stank bad. So anyways, originally they're from Green Bay, Wisconsin, then they were forced to relocate to Iowa, then to Minnesota, then to another part of Minnesota, then to South Dakota, and finally to Nebraska. And with each forced relocation, many tribal members died in transit, and many also deserted, going wherever they could. And it's likely that on one of these treks, John Elk and possibly his wife separated from the main group and struck out on his own, eventually landing in Omaha, about 100 miles downriver, what would eventually be the Winnebago Reservation in Nebraska. This backstory, plus the fact that in 1880 he was still living in a wigwam, suggests that Elk probably sought American citizenship less from a desire to assimilate into white society and more out of a desire to escape the vicious cycle of forced relocation after relocation. Regardless, sometime in early 1880, he was recruited by an activist organization called Friends of the Indian, mostly white, who anointed themselves friends of the Indian, to help challenge the exclusion of Native Americans from citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And in April 1880, he attempted to register to vote in a local municipal election in Omaha, Nebraska, but was denied registration by the registrar, Charles Wilkins, because as a Native American, he was not considered a United States citizen. In the ensuing legal battle, Elk's lawyers, paid for by the activist group that included him, consistently represented him as a hardworking, tax-paying man who had voluntarily separated from his tribe, had repudiated his tribe, and gone over to join white civilization by living among whites and accepting their ways. And in doing so, they argued he had renounced his tribal allegiance and become an American citizen by virtue of the place of his birth. Again, bis soli, right of soil. As we've seen, this retelling of his backstory might have been stretching the truth a bit, but believe it or not, it was widely accepted by the courts as factual. Nevertheless, in 1884, the Supreme Court ruled against Elk. Writing for the majority, Justice Horace Gray ruled that because Indians were born, quote, members of and owing immediate allegiance to one of the Indian tribes, although in a geographical sense born in the United States, they were nonetheless excluded from citizenship in the same way as children born outside of the United States or children born in the United States to, quote, ambassadors or other public ministers of foreign nations. They could potentially become citizens, said the court, but only through new naturalization legislation passed by Congress. What Congress eventually did in 1924 with the Indian Naturalization Act. But basically, the Supreme Court is saying, no, jus soli does not apply to Native Americans, which, to be fair to the Supreme Court's ruling, is actually what the text of the 14th Amendment said. So there's not much you can do there. The court's ruling, it should be noted, was not unanimous. In a fiery dissent, there we go. In a fiery dissent, Justice John Marshall Harlan, who a decade later would pen the most important dissenting opinion in American history, in Plessy versus Ferguson, declared that any Native American who, in, quote, good faith, separated himself from his tribe and had, quote, fully and completely surrendered to U.S. jurisdiction had become a citizen by virtue of his birth, by virtue of repudiating his prior allegiance. If that were not true, Harlan argued, this is the dissenting opinion I want you to pay attention to. If that were not true, Harlan argued, the whole purpose of the 14th Amendment would have failed, for there would still be, quote, in this country, a despised and rejected class of persons with no nationality, whatever. Still be in this country, despised and rejected class of persons with no nationality whatsoever. What Harlan is basically saying there, in a nutshell, is to have a class of people who are within this country, living within this country, excluded from American citizenship, runs counter to the very essence, the very spirit, and the very letter of the 14th Amendment. Native Americans, of course, were not the only despised and rejected class of persons in the late 19th century in America. So too were Chinese, which brings me to the man pictured here, Wong Kim Ark. What do we know about him? Well, Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco. around 1870 in the upstairs bedroom of a grocery store on Sacramento Street, operated by his Chinese parents, who had immigrated to the United States a few years before. The 1870s and 80s were a time of increasing social and political unrest throughout the Western states and territories. It's nativist groups like the virulently nativist and racist California Working Men's Party sought to lay blame for cyclical economic turmoil at the feet of recent immigrants from Asia, who, by the way, had been instrumental in building the western end of the Transcontinental Railroad, which made modern California possible in the first place. Chinese immigrants were frequent targets of white vigilante act during this period. 4 years before Wong Kim Ark's birth, a mob of 400 angry white miners had driven Chinese workers out of Virginia City, Nevada. 2 years later, a mob in Los Angeles murdered at least 17 Chinese immigrants in LA's Chinatown district. When Wong was a boy of 10 or 12, we're not exactly sure what year it was, somewhere between 1870 and 1870. When he was a boy of around 10 or 12, he would have heard reports of the Rock Springs Massacre in Rock Springs, Wyoming, where another white mob had butchered at least 28 Chinese miners and burned down their homes. A few years later, 34 Chinese miners were murdered by mob action at a place called Deep Creek in Hells Canyon, Oregon. The bodies of the victims were thrown into nearby Snake River, where many floated dozens of miles downstream into neighboring Idaho, bearing the unmistakable signs of torture. In the face of mounting anti-Chinese hysteria, Congress passed the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, one of the most explicitly racist pieces of federal legislation in the nation's history. It barred all future immigration from China for about a decade. And explicitly declared all current Chinese immigrants living in the United States ineligible for citizenship. Perhaps considering this rising tide of anti-Chinese sentiment, Wong's parents ultimately decided to return to China permanently. Wong, having been born and raised in America, considered the U.S. his home, and ultimately decided to stay. He did make at least 2 return trips to China, however, both to visit his parents and to get married to a woman named Yi Chi, with whom he fathered 2 children. After returning from the second trip in 1895, he was arrested and detained by federal customs officials on the ground that as a child of foreign parents, his citizenship was invalid. Wong sued, took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1898, finally delivered a verdict. Keep in mind that the Supreme Court in 1898 that decided the U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark case was hardly what you would call a progressive court. 2 years earlier, they had delivered one of the most infamous decisions in the court's history, Leslie versus Ferguson, which enunciated the separate but equal doctrine that greenlit the birth of Jim Crow in the South. But in United States versus Wong Kim Ark, the court faced a relatively simple legal question. What does the 14th Amendment mean when it says, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States? What does that guarantee actually mean? The court at that time looked at the plain text of the 14th Amendment and determined that, yes, it actually did apply to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, declaring that, quote, the 14th Amendment affirms the ancient and fundamental rule of citizenship by birth within the territory, including all children here born of resident aliens. Much has been made. Much has been made, particularly in certain feverish online circles, of the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof, with some suggesting that it excludes the children of undocumented or illegal immigrants. But as the conservative legal scholar and Federalist Society member and federal judge, James C. Ho, by the way, was appointed by the Trump administration, has observed, this interpretation is absurd on its face. Foreign nationals living in the U.S. are subject to the jurisdiction thereof because they are required to obey U.S. law. If they were not, the U.S. government would have no authority even to arrest, imprison, or indeed to deport them, because they would be beyond the jurisdiction of the United States. There are only a handful of exceptions outlined in Wong Kim Ark to this rule. Children of foreign ambassadors and diplomatic staff, because such people actually do enjoy limited immunity from federal law. Children born to members of invading foreign armies. So, like, Red Dawn scenario. The United States, you see the remake of Red Dawn, where we get invaded by North Korea.
Oh, yeah.
When they raid a subway. The only way North Korea ever invades the U.S. is if we hear about Subway. But yeah, in that scenario, any children born to members of invading foreign armies would not be covered. And then Native Americans, whose tribes, as I mentioned above, were effectively considered foreign nations, and for that reason did not receive citizenship until a federal statute granted it in 1924. Moreover, as Judge Ho observes, those who argue that subject to the jurisdiction thereof excludes children of foreign nationals ignore the fact that both supporters and opponents of the 14th Amendment understood it to do exactly the opposite. Some members of Congress, like the nativist Pennsylvania Senator Edgar Cowan, opposed the current wording of the amendment that I showed you in Section 1, precisely because he believed that it would extend citizenship to U.S.-born children of Chinese nationals. So the case of Chinese nationals living in the U.S. was explicitly considered. Supporters of the amendment, however, rebuffed those concerns, stating that they were entirely ready to accept that outcome. In response to Senator Cowan debate on the floor of the U.S. Senate, Senator John Conness, a supporter of the amendment, said, quote, "The proposition before us relates simply in that respect to the children begotten of Chinese parents in California, and it is proposed to declare that they shall be citizens. It is proposed to declare that they shall be citizens. I am in favor of doing so. We are entirely ready to accept the provision proposed in this constitutional amendment." This is a senator from California saying there are some children of Chinese immigrants born in California, born on American soil, they're American citizens. As the representative of California, he was saying he was okay with that. The 1898 ruling preserved Wong Kim Ark citizenship, but it did not remove every legal difficulty for him. It did not, for example, allow him to bring his wife to the United States. She was still barred from immigrating by the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did, however, allow him to live and work in the United States, earn a living, support his family, including his two sons, one of whom, a U.S. citizen by virtue of his father, later emigrated to the United States and fought for his country during World War II. And so too, the third Indian covered in tonight's lecture, a young man named Santiago. Santiago was born in Loic City in the province of Ilocos Norte, Philippines. He immigrated to the United States around the year 1929. Unlike the other two individuals examined in this lecture, Santiago did not become famous. His name certainly never found its way into any Supreme Court rulings. But his story intersects with the contested history of American citizenship. in a variety of interesting and useful ways. He came to the United States for the most ordinary, commonplace work. Start a family, free country, build a better life for himself and any children he might have. His ethnicity, Filipino, is important to this story. As a result of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Philippines had become a U.S. territory, colony, for all intents and purposes. And Filipinos, consequently, became American nationals, but not quite U.S. citizens. Indeed, the status of Filipinos in the United States after 1898 is something of a legal anomaly. They were officially classified as, and this is the official legal terminology for it, non-citizen U.S. nationals. Non-citizen U.S. nationals, meaning that they owed allegiance to the U.S. government because the U.S. government owned their islands, but they did not have the full rights of citizenship. They could not vote, for example. They could not hold public office, nor could they easily become U.S. citizens. They could, however, legally emigrate to the United States, live here, work here, and build families here. And that is exactly what Santiago did. When he arrived in the United States in 1929, Filipinos were still very much, borrow Justice Harlan's phrasing, a despised and rejected class of persons, subject to all manner of legal disabilities and exclusions. Like the Chinese, they were targets of frequent race riots, lynchings. In many of the Western states, for example, they faced discrimination not dissimilar to that encountered by African Americans in the Jim Crow South. Many public facilities, restaurants, hotels, and the like explicitly excluded Filipinos by hanging signs in their windows that read "No Filipinos allowed," or sometimes "No dogs, no Filipinos allowed." Many skilled trades were closed to them, often by union rules rather than by legislation. California and several other Western states enforced laws banning Filipino and white intermarriage. By the way, about 14 out of every 15 Filipino immigrants to the United States were men. So the fact that they were legally forbidden from marrying white women left them with limited romantic opportunities. As a consequence, and this is just a humorous side note, throughout the Western states, in places like California and Nevada, Arizona here, and institutions called taxi dance halls, where Filipino men, if there was a large concentration of Filipinos, would go and they would pay money, a few pennies, to dance with working class white gals from the just dance. And that was about the only way that they ever got any feminine companionship whatsoever. So they had laws banning Filipino and white intermarriage. When California Supreme Court ruled in 1933 that the state's anti-miscegenation law, which banned white intermarriage with, quote, Mongoloids, did not technically apply to Filipinos because Filipinos were not Mongols, they were not part of the Golden Horde. California changed the law to include Mongoloids or Malays. Filipinos were considered to be of Malay ancestry. So they changed the law to keep Filipinos banned from marrying white people. Perhaps for that reason, Santiago chose not to emigrate to California, to New York, where he already had an older brother living, Jose Marcos, or Uncle Joe, as the family called him. While there, he met and married a young woman by the name of Genovia Jean Saraduk, a woman of Russian and Ukrainian ancestry. Some documents list her ancestry as Ruthenian, which is a Slavic people group from the part of the Carpathian Mountains that bridge Ukraine and Poland. She was kind of like Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian, depending on how you squint at it. 2 years before his marriage to Jean, 1936, Congress passed something called the Tidings-McDuffie Act. They were married in 1936. 2 years before, in 1934, Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which stripped all Filipinos of even the limited American nationality that they had enjoyed before. So instead of non-citizen U.S. nationals, they became simply aliens. So they're basically the only ethnicity in American history, large ethnic group in American history that I know of, at least, that actually were U.S. nationals for an extended period of time and actually were denaturalized based on their place of birth and or ethnicity. Were denaturalized. Nevertheless, Tidings McDuffie did not immediately deport all Filipinos living in the United States. And Santiago was able to continue living here with his wife in the U.S. as an alien. In 1941, he was drafted into the U.S. Navy because not being a citizen didn't mean you couldn't get drafted. His draft paperwork listed his age at 31, his height at 5'5", and his weight at a strapping 118 pounds. God. There's his draft paperwork. He served in the U.S. Navy as a cook for the next 4 years, seeing action in the Pacific. And the year after the war ended, he was naturalized. The U.S. government expedited naturalization for foreign nationals who served in the military. And he became once more an American in 1946. I wish I could tell you Santiago lived a long and happy life years after his service to his country, or rather, I guess I should say, to a country not his own, because it wasn't his country in the same World War II. But the truth is, years after the war, were not kind to my. He came home from the war a changed man, suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, war neurosis, but what today we call PTSD. He self-medicated with alcohol. And although he and Jean did have 4 children together, he was not always around to raise them. He was frequent comments, often living on the streets. Sometime in the 19th. Sometime in the 1970s, he stumbled into the Salvation Army shelter in Skid Row, in New York City's Bowery, where he converted to Christianity and began trying to dry out. He wrote a lot of letters about his newfound faith to his children. As a result, many of them converted as well. He died of pneumonia in 1978, as well as the complications of his alcoholism. In one of his final letters to his family members, he expressed the hope that he could just hang on long enough to see his son James, who happens to be my father, graduate from seminary, training to be a Muslim. Unfortunately, we missed it by 4 months. The story of Santiago Beltran Hernando represents the flip side. One of the persistent myths of American immigration. We like to tell ourselves, out of the wide-eyed, innocent foreigner who comes to this land of promise and finds in it the fulfillment of all his hopes and dreams. The truth is that immigration is inherently risky. It's the ultimate high-risk, high-reward gamble, in which immigrants make a bet on geography, with the stakes being their lives, their whole lives. And it doesn't always work out. At least in the American context, however, it has usually worked out for the children. Santiago may have died a broken man, but simply by virtue of relocating to this sprawling and dynamic country, he conferred on his children opportunities that they could not have had elsewhere. His children would go on to become teachers, nurses, counselors, in my father's case, college professor. I am. Over the last century, tens of millions of immigrants have made a similar bet on geography. as Santiago did. The dividends reaped by their children and this country have been enormous. There's a plethora of data that tends to show that whether you're looking at K through 12 educational outcomes or college performance, career attainment, immigrants and the children of immigrants typically do better than children of the native born. In 2019, for example, a record 8 children took home a share of the championship in the Scripps National Spelling Bee, the largest number of champions ever. Basically, they all tied. They all tied. The headline in the New York Times that week read, "The dictionary concedes." 7 out of the 8 were the children of immigrants. 7 out of the 8. In 2023, a stunning 46% of all Fortune 500, 46% were founded by immigrants or their children. And today, the so-called Magnificent Seven tech companies that are driving the US economy, 6 were founded or co-founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. See the list right there. I've highlighted the last one, Microsoft, because it's the exception to the rule. Bill Gates, Paul Allen, both of them native born, and their parents are native born. All of the others were founded by either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And a key component to that success story has been the simple fact, for well over a century, immigrants like my grandfather have come to this country knowing that there is one immutable, unchangeable benefit to betting their lives on this country. It's the guarantee that John Elk fought for. It's the guarantee that Wong Kim Ark won. No matter what happened, no matter how it worked out for them personally, very least, their children would always belong to America. America would always belong to America. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions.
Joel, how did Congress get around sending native-born people of Japanese ancestry to concentration camps in the United States during World War? I mean, using the war as the excuse. Was there an argument about?
I mean, the argument was that they were potential spies and saboteurs.
Yeah.
Which in 99.9999% of the cases was completely baseless. There's no evidence. There's no hard evidence that any of the subjects of the Japanese internment policies, 412,000, were actually spies. No, they didn't. No, they didn't. It's a really dubious argument, but they got away with it because of the state of public opinion in America at that time. There's for just a few years, there's a great book about this. John Dower's War Without Mercy talks about the American and Japanese side of World War II. For a number of years during and just a couple of years immediately after World War II, Americans hated the Japanese as much as they ever hated any nationality or ethnicity, because of the profound sense of betrayal and personal affront that they felt over Pearl Harbor. That event just completely reoriented public opinion. We went from being like a land of doves, with mostly anti-war, being raging war hawks overnight. Much of our animus, much of our ire was directed towards the Japanese because they're a relatively small ethnicity. There's a lot more German Americans than there are Japanese Americans. Also, the German Americans had been around for a lot more. German Americans have been in this country since the colonial period. Pennsylvania Dutch Pennsylvania Dutch are actually people of German ancestry in Pennsylvania, started coming over in the William Penn. They've been around forever. They're also white, hard to differentiate from the rest of Americans. So it's hard to hate them as a people group. Although some Americans made an attempt. More during World War I than World War II. During World War I, a lot of German Americans were harassed and intimidated. A lot of them changed their last names, went from German to anglicized versions. Mueller became Miller, and so on. But during World War II, that had pretty much already happened, and you also had another convenient people group, the one that had actually attacked us. So American propaganda during World War II really focused, when it was about the Nazis, it was all directed towards Hitler. He was the evil leader, and the Germans were just the people who had been duped or deceived by him into this evil. Whereas the Japanese people in general were the subject of demonization. People as apes and monkeys and vermin, insects, and so on. There's a famous American cartoonist by the name of Theodore Geisel, who is enlisted into a propaganda effort during World War II. And he drafts something like 400 or 500, I forget the exact number, anti-Japanese cartoons. Then you know Theodore Geisel as Dr. Seuss. It's really a head trip. Read that book that I mentioned. It's really a head trip. Like there's a whole bunch of these anti-Japanese cartoons that look just like 14 Years a You. And because they were drawn up by the same person. It's like Dr. Seuss suddenly went.
It's like Disney made a lot of anti-German propaganda.
By the way, after the war, he kind of repented of that, and he wrote 14 Years a Who as kind of an apology for his role in disseminating anti-Japanese propaganda. Which is why the famous line from 14 Years a Who is, "Person is a person, no matter how small." Sorry, I blathered on there. Next question. Go ahead, Vaughn.
So let me see if I can phrase this correctly. In the event that birthright citizenship is ended, what does that mean for children of parents who migrate to the US from US colonies?
So like Puerto Rico, for example. So it wouldn't affect Puerto Rico. So there is an executive order in particular that's like specifically dealing with them, and that's the subject of the current litigation. But that order would not affect Puerto Ricans. More people from Guam, more people from American Samoa, all of whom are already U.S. citizens. Nor would it affect the children's parents from those people, those places who come to the continental United States because they're coming from American soil. So it wouldn't have an effect on them. On the other hand, if this sort of thing can be done by executive order, which is like one component of the legal, which is really weird. The idea that this could be done just by one person saying it. Then who knows what the next executive order might say. Go ahead. An executive order, well, executive orders in general. So it comes out of the legal footing of all executive orders is the same. President is the chief executive officer, if you will. He's the CEO of the federal bureaucracy, the chief executive. That's actually his actual job description. His job is to execute the laws of Congress. So,
Sorry, a little sidebar.
Execute meaning to carry into effect. Not like take him out behind the shed and shoot. Carry into effect laws of Congress. So because of that, it is presumed that in pursuance of that objective, the president can issue orders to the various departments and agencies of the federal bureaucracy, telling them how to enforce Congress's laws. And that is what executive orders are supposed to be. Many presidents including 250 years, have stretched and 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 stretched the idea of executive orders into a lot of areas that probably the framers of the Constitution never anticipated. And now we're in this weird space, particularly with our basically disenfranchised Congress. Congress is not really doing its job, not legislating, not dictating policy. The executive branch has to a large degree stepped in and assumed whatever for all intents and purposes is a legislative function, setting policy rather than executing the policies directed by congressional legislation. And that has been a problem for a long, including both Democratic and Republican administrations, something that I tell my students all the time. One of the biggest solutions to our present democratic woes would be for Congress to simply do it. Yeah, I was gonna say wrote something, but I'm supposed to keep this PG. So yes, do their freaking jobs and start passing laws again. When one of the other branches overreach is try to actually restrain them. But Congress doesn't seem to be properly incentivized to do that. And they haven't been for a long time.
Making too much money.
Well, you'd think they'd make more money if they actually had power. They don't seem to mind not having power because we have a lot of people in Congress, again, in both parties, who are basically performance artists. They are there to raise money and be famous. And get lots of clicks. And be on television a lot. And get up on some posts.
I have a question back to something you had said earlier. What was the law, for lack of a better word, around drafting non-citizens to a war? Where did that come from? What was the history behind that, or the?
It's a good question. It's been around for a while. I don't know exactly when it starts, if I'm being honest with you. I didn't really research that before, so. Well, I know that we did it in World War I, we did it in World War II, we've been doing it ever since then. We probably did it. Okay, for example, during the American Civil War, there were Irish immigrants who were escaping the potato famine in Ireland, who would step off the boat and find themselves conscripted into the Union Army, for example. So we've been doing it for a long time.
Was there anything on the books that actually says that could have happened, or
Yeah,
still?
draft laws.
Draft laws.
Draft laws. They typically apply to US residents, not just American citizens. So, yeah, we've been drafting non-citizen residents of the US for a long, long time. Typically applies to all men between this age and that age who are able-bodied and can bear arms. Yes.
I think mostly it was primarily proximity, like literally just being on US soil.
Yeah.
From what it seems like the research that I've done independently.
Yeah. Any other questions?
In Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans got citizenship in 1917. Before it ran. Was there any discussion of the Philippines at that time, or was Philippines off the table?
Philippines were basically off the table. I forget. It wasn't exactly in 1898. I forget exactly when they came up with this non-citizen US national designation, but it was shortly after. They were basically non-citizen US nationals all the way up to the tidings McDuffie of 1934 when they just became to make a long story short, no, they didn't really consider giving Puerto Ricans American citizenship. As a matter of fact, public sentiment was, sorry, not Puerto Ricans, Filipinos with citizenship. As a matter of fact, public sentiment is going pretty strongly in the other direction, as evidenced by tidings I should also mention, just to be totally transparent and fair, part of the reason why Hyden's McDuffie was passed is because we were talking about starting the process of giving the Philippines their independence. And so the idea was they don't need American nationality anymore because they're going to become independent. But that kept on getting kicked on down the road, getting kicked down the road. And then a little thing called World War II happened, and the Philippines were occupied by the Japanese, who were even worse than the American. And then we came back in and back in 1945, took over the Philippines again. And then a year later, the Philippines get their independence in 1846. Yes.
Were all Hawaiians granted citizenship when Hawaii was like became the 50th state, right?
That's a great question. I don't actually know. I would, when they became the 50th state,
Yeah.
yes, by then they were. I don't actually know off the top of my head when Hawaiians,
1959.
they all became citizens just in 1959.
Yep, along with Alaska.
Okay, I'll have to look that up. I would want to say, you sure about that, Nelson?
I looked it up like maybe 3 times
Okay,
in the past.
that's cool. Well, you have family from Hawaii?
My grandpa Steve.
Okay, all right, family connection there. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, I could be wrong, but some countries have some sort of birthright citizenship
Yes.
laws in place. And
I couldn't tell you which ones do and which ones don't.
my understanding, most of them are doing. And I was just wondering, does that have to do with along a country that's been a country, the older countries have different kind of rules, different? Is that just because the idea was new?
It's basically up to the individual. I should say most countries have jus sanguinis, which is citizenship by blood. So you're a citizen if your parents are citizens. The United States has always practiced jus sanguinis and jus soli. We've always had both. And the whole history of American citizenship was really kind of convoluted, and here I'm getting into stuff that I didn't really prep for. But for a long, long time, the idea of naturalization, or the whole process of naturalization, was a lot simpler than it is today. For a long, long time, you were presumed to become an American if you got it. And to be formally naturalized, all you really had to do, and I think this is true up until about sometime in the 1890s, all you really had to do was take an oath of loyalty before a justice of the peace. And then you became an American. I don't remember the specific date. I believe it was sometime in the 1890s. And then we started imposing a lot more rules. And then we really started imposing a lot more rules in the 1920s. So the year 1924, when we passed the Indian Naturalization Act, it was the year before that, in 1923, that we passed another law creating a quota system. Quota system, where basically we broke down the US population by ethnic and national categories in the US Census of 1920. And so we only allowed a certain number of immigrants into the country total, and each country got an allotment quota based on the percentage of that ethnicity in the United States in 1920. It was very, very strict and very, very rigorously enforced. And that wasn't repealed until the 1950s. So, any other questions?
Thank you very much.
I'll have a wonderful evening.